From a bunch of different people now. We've heard from scholars, people who have really spent time deep in these topics and thinking about these things. But now we're going to hear from someone who's closer to our age, a PhD student at MIT, studying chemistry, working with biology, mRNA, RNA, all of that stuff, all the bio majors know. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sam Detmer.
Testing. Just seeing if this is working. Good. Hello? Maybe I'll try with the mic. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. For one, I'm very grateful to be here, since the one thing I've learned from all the talks I've attended at Reason for God is that I'm definitely not qualified to be here. In fact, most of the people who have come before me have PhD degrees or professional degrees, and here I am. My highest level of achievement so far is just master's in physics from a school down the street, we'll leave unnamed. And currently, I'm course 5 here at MIT, so I've left the dark side, at least mostly. So today, I guess I'll touch on a little bit of my research, just in case it's of interest. I study reprogramming T cells in order to help them to fight cancer, and then also, as Mide mentioned, I also work on modifying mRNA chemically in order to improve its stability and delivery properties for medicinal purposes. Okay, so the topic I was planning to present on today is the question of whether scientific progress has left God behind, whether there is any need for God now that science has pretty much figured out everything. And I'd like to report that there's a great proof, I think, that I've found for the existence of God, and it goes more or less like this. If there is no God, then how is it that all of the continents together look just exactly like a chicken if you put them together? Okay, this is ridiculous, obviously. But I think that sometimes when you have people of faith talking about why they believe, it can honestly sound a lot like this. I know it certainly has to me. And so what I'd like to emphasize is that what I'm sharing here today is just my story. These are just the reasons that I find compelling. I don't necessarily expect these to be proofs or anything universal, but I do appreciate the chance to just honestly share with you how I approach these questions in my own personal life and through my studies as someone here at MIT, not unlike most of you. So now I'd like to talk about the quote that my talk hinges on. It's a quote from Heisenberg, who was a foundational physicist early in the 1900s in quantum mechanics. And he writes that the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. That's an interesting claim, right? Because I can definitely see how the first sip would turn you into an atheist. In fact, I think if you look carefully at the evidence that most people used to have in, say, the ancient world for the existence of a God, it was largely to explain physical events that occurred around them. So, for example, a solar eclipse, or why the wind blows from certain directions. You could just invoke a deity to explain those things. Sorry, overshot there. But what we now have is the ability to actually directly observe most of the things that ancient peoples needed gods to explain. So, for example, we can send a probe to take a picture like this one of the sun, so we see exactly what's going on there. And likewise, we can explain most of the other kind of meteorological phenomena that people would have used to believe in a god. So the question is there really any need for God at all anymore now that we have kind of figured out how the world works? I mean, we have answers to all of these questions in terms of evolution, in terms of chemistry and physics. What does God add to the picture? So for me, there are, I think, 3 modern scientific discoveries. These were not known to ancient peoples that help reinforce my faith in God. I don't think these are conclusive, but I'd like to just briefly go over at least these 3 things, which I think might pique some interest. The first thing is that the universe had a beginning. Now, like I said, this is not at all obvious. Many scientists before the discovery of a modern cosmology believed in what's called a steady-state universe, that matter and time and space had pretty much always exist and would always exist into the future. And what really sparked a revolution in that way of thinking is the discovery that there were certain galaxies who were receding faster from us than others. And the way they measure this is not unlike the way that a police car would measure the speed of a moving vehicle, they observed the frequency shift from light that came from these galaxies using spectral lines that are of known atomic emission. And because they were then able to see, based off of the frequency shift, how fast far away galaxies were moving from us, they were able to find a correlation between the distance from Earth and how fast they're moving away. It looks almost linear. And the best explanation that they could come up with is that just as if you inflated a balloon that had 2 points that were close together on it and 2 points that were farther apart, on that balloon, the 2 points that were close together would move apart slowly because there's not much space of rubber in between them. But the 2 points that are farther apart are going to move apart more rapidly because there's just more space that's expanding in between them. And so this surprising discovery that the universe was expanding, and even now we know accelerating in its expansion, led the people to think, well, what if we just reversed the clock backwards? And so when you do that, you end up condensing the entire universe into a very hot, dense mass, which we also know from general relativity is going to warp space and time. And this causes us to ask the question, well, why? Where did it come from? It's easy to say that the universe is kind of the all that there is if it is the only thing that's ever been around. But if we know that the universe at some point in time, or at least because time is warped at some place or something, that it didn't exist in the form that we see it today, it makes us wonder, I think, at least it certainly makes me wonder, why the universe came into being at all, and what kind of things could have also led it to pop into existence in the first place. So yeah, I won't bore you with any more evidence for it, but there's multiple other lines, including the cosmic background radiation and the abundance of different types of nuclei in the galaxy. So this brings me to my second point, which, and in terms of asking what kind of force could have brought the universe into existence, we see that the universe is well ordered. And so this is building off a little bit of the experience I had at CERN, where we were working on trapping antimatter atoms. The reason that we were trying to trap antimatter atoms is because there's very, very little antimatter in the universe, even though our physical theories predict that there should be equal amounts of both. And what I mean by our physical theories predict is this. Back in the early 1900s, there were two compelling theories that had been advanced by Einstein and then by other scientists like Heisenberg. These theories were the quantum mechanics and special relativity. But at a mathematical level, they were incompatible. The theory of quantum mechanics is not Lorentz invariant. It permits travel faster than the speed of light. And because of this, a lot of researchers worked on mathematical theories, which were not yet physically proven, in order to try to combine the two just for the sake of mathematical coherence. And what they found, in particular a physicist in England named Paul Dirac, was that there was a way to combine them, but when you created this equation, it would lead to both positive and negative solutions. So the positive solutions were well understood to be normal matter. Negative solutions were just purely a prediction of the theory. No one had seen them before. But not too long later, they actually were able to detect the formation of positively charged electrons, which are a real thing. They exist as antimatter and can annihilate with normal matter. And this was predicted solely on the base of the mathematical equations themselves. And this is not the only such story. The Higgs boson, the top quark, and many other fundamental particles have been predicted just by saying, let's take a look at the equations, let's hope that they turn out to be nice mathematically, and then go out into the world and see what that would lead us to expect. And lo and behold, the universe actually seems to care enough about mathematical elegance and simplicity that you can be an armchair physicist. You can sit back without having any observations. Why is that? That is crazy to me, I think. Math is a construct of our human thinking. It doesn't necessarily have to correspond to anything in the physical world. And yet atoms can do linear algebra far better than you or I can, and they can get it right every time. So I find that at least a peculiar fact about our universe. And I think if you look even closer at the types of laws that govern the universe, they are actually improbably designed in such a way as to support something that could be interesting, to support potentially life, for example. And I'll give you one famous example of this. Again, it's a discrepancy between two theories, basically the later generations of the theories that I mentioned earlier. Einstein's theory of general relativity which explains how matter and energy curves space and time, and it's our best current theory for large-scale physical phenomena like galaxy formation. And then quantum field theory, or quantum electrodynamics, well, in general, the standard model, which is our best understanding of how the world operates at a microscopic scale. And in general relativity, there is a dependence of the expansion of the universe on the energy that's contained within space-time itself. So actually, the expansion of the universe can be kind of thought of as belonging to the fact that that space itself has a negative energy, so it kind of exerts a negative gravity of sorts, pushing things apart. And that is due to the cosmological constant lambda, which I've labeled in red. Now, the good news is that quantum field theory also predicts that space should have background energy. And the way that you can calculate this is that every field, every type of particle that can exist is supposed to be kind of like a harmonic oscillator or a spring. These particles can kind of pop into existence, they can pop out of existence, and because they can pop in very briefly and pop out, there's on average a non-negligible amount of particle in the universe. So you can actually do this calculation and you can see, well, does the calculation from quantum field theory align with that of general relativity? Now there's one more thing I should point out, which is that due to the mathematical substructure, quantum field theory does not depend on an absolute energy like general relativity. So it is possible, consistent with the theory, to adjust the background energy by some constant c, which you could determine afterwards. But that is not possible in general relativity. And so what physicists have done is they've done the calculation and they've shown that the constant c that must be added to get the expansion of the universe that we observe today is so finely tuned that it needs to be precise to the power of 10, to the factor of 10 to the power of minus 120. So I've done my best here. I think that's 120 zeros showing you how small that number is. That's the margin of error for life, right there. If we were off by just a few orders of magnitude, the universe would either go off expanding super rapidly into oblivion, or it could have crushed into some kind of a heat death. And pretty much between there is the only area where not just life, but anything interesting could have formed. Now, this is weird, I think, and it's not the only example of fine-tuning. There are many, I would say 6 or 7 well-known and well-cited examples of the constants which underlie the physical structure of our world being exactly the values that they need to be in order to have interesting phenomena happen, and that if these constants were tuned off by even a hair's breadth, they would lead to the complete obliteration of the universe as we know it. So all of these 3 things lead me to think that maybe there's some kind of a cosmic force behind the universe, maybe some kind of an intelligence that maybe explains some of the amazing order and symmetry that we see in nature. And if you had caught me maybe 3 years ago, that's where my talk would have ended. I would have said, that's it, I believe in God, and thank you very much. But unfortunately, you all are going to have to listen to me a little bit more, if you so desire, because I have a lot of questions, I think, that are not currently answered. And in fact, because at the time I started writing this talk, nearly a couple years ago, I was actually having a difficult time in the church. I had had some negative experiences within Christian community. Tackling some of these questions nearly caused me to lose my faith in God. So that's why I'd really like to take the rest of the time here to explore these with you. And while I don't have any answers, as I mentioned before, to think a little bit about some of the things that one could say about major objections to there being a personal God. So the first and perhaps most important objection I'd like to address is this just a classic God of the gaps argument? Are we basically doing lazy science? Have we said, here's something that we can't explain, therefore God, and then not really pause to think whether or not future scientific progress could actually fill in that gap without a need for God? A second kind of also very important question is maybe we've provided some evidence for a cosmic order, but does this have anything to do with a personal God, such as that described in the religions of Islam or Christianity? I still don't see that evidence from what I've presented so far. Thirdly, we have physical observations to verify things in the natural world. I can hold this water bottle, I could drink this water if I wanted, and I would know that it exists. And this is true for many other things that we believe about science, but it's not true about God. No one has ever touched God, not that I know of at least, and no one has seen God. So how do we really know that God is there? I mean, all of our other observations seem to be based on empirical evidence, and yet some people in the world claim that there's a God, and it seems like it's not based at all on any kind of observations. And then finally, I'll just go over these last two quickly. I think that there are some significant design flaws, one might say, looking at the human body. The appendix, for example, which is a vestigial organ that causes infections, doesn't seem to do a whole lot of good. Or humans have a susceptibility to cancer that indicates maybe they weren't originally, ideally, supposed to have a long lifespan, unlike elephants, for example, which are very resistant to cancer. And this poses questions about whether the human body was designed after all. Similarly, I think, well, maybe not similarly, but I think another question that's challenging is why many scientists do believe in God, but in general, scientists, at least in the United States, are less likely to believe in God than your average person. So all of these questions were things that really I struggled with, and still, to an extent, wrestle with. I'm not going to be able to address all of them now during the talk, so I'm really going to focus in on the first three. But there was going to be a question and answer afterwards, and so I'd love to enter into discussion with you all on the second pair as well. So the first of these questions I'm going to talk about is the God of the gaps, right? Have we just basically invoked God to take care of things that science will ultimately explain? And this has been done in the past, right? You can take examples of perhaps the formation of rocks. You could say maybe people didn't understand how limestone could form over millions of years, and so they might have just said God created the earth in its current state, and then later science was able to explain things that people at that time used as evidence for God, and so thereby kind of negating that evidence. And so the question is, maybe this fine-tuning stuff, that will all get explained at some point in the future. And I'll address that concern from my perspective in a second, but I want to first start off here just with a picture of a snowflake. And we could admire the snowflake. It's pretty amazing. It's got radial symmetry, six-fold. It is amazingly, each snowflake is different, but they're also intricately arranged along each of the radial axes so that they parallel each other. And I'd like to consider two different levels of explanation for how this snowflake formed. The first one is, let's suppose that you ask someone before the advent of modern science, how do snowflakes form? Maybe they would have said something like, God has snow up in his storehouses, and then he pours it out, and he makes each of the snowflakes individually by hand, and that's how we get these snowflakes, right? That's one explanation. What would we say today? I don't think we fully understand this, but my best understanding of this process is that at some point, there's a tiny little crystal that forms up in the upper atmosphere, and it gets blown around between regions of varying temperature and pressure. And as it does so, the processes of crystallization change slightly, depending on the temperature and the pressure of the region it's entered. But the amazing thing is that the crystallization processes happen exactly the same way along each axis, so perfectly that it's able to maintain this symmetry all the way out through all of the different regions that it blows through until it comes down to Earth as something like this. Now I ask you this question. Which one of those is a more amazing explanation? Which one of those kind of evokes the imagination more and causes wonder or appreciation? In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but I think the second explanation is actually more compelling. It's more interesting. How is it that the universe is so well organized that the laws are always accurate enough to form symmetrical snowflakes like this? No invariance anywhere. I think this speaks to the point that modern science has answered a lot of questions, but it also has raised a lot of questions. I would argue that maybe modern science has raised more questions than it's answered with quantum mechanics and the relativity of space and time and many other things that we've learned. And I think that along with this sense of wonder, it befits us as people in the sciences to also have a sense of humility. So as a kind of a more humorous example, I'd like to take Lord Kelvin's quote from 1897. Kelvin, obviously a very smart guy. We named our temperature system after him. He wrote that there's nothing new to be discovered in physics now. This was in 1897. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. Well, boy, was he wrong, right? I mean, I'm not going to go through all the lists here, but I mean, we learned that atoms exist, first of all. We learned that particles can go through walls. We learned that space and time are relative, that events can happen in different orders for different people depending on where they live, that particles that are far apart in space and time can be entangled and seemingly communicate with each other faster than the speed of light. It's not real communication, but the effect is there. This is crazy, right? All of this stuff would have been incomprehensible, I think, to the 19th century physicist if you just threw it on them all at once. And yet, people thought they had figured it all out at the end of the 1900s. So I think we also find ourselves today in a place of great technological and intellectual control over the natural world. We are able to do a lot of things that we've been wanting to do as people for quite a while. We can fly, we can compute things, we can take pictures at ease. But let's not let that illusion of control take over our sense of wonder and humility, which I think ought to be present when we realize how much there is to know and how little we fully understand it. And as a last point on the God of the Gaps, I just want to illustrate that I think the questions we're asking today are actually not so different from the questions that ancient peoples were asking. So let's take as an example, where do human beings come from? Maybe in the past, I don't know, the ancient Greeks, I think, believed that some of their early forebears threw rocks over their shoulders and that those rocks turns into human beings. Okay, fair enough, right? I mean, I don't know what I would have thought if I was at that time, but I wouldn't have had a compelling reason to doubt that. Nowadays, we have lots of evidence. We have fossil evidence, we have genetic evidence that suggests that human beings may have evolved from lower animals. And we understand this process of evolution mostly because we understand the process of heredity and how genes are transferred through conveying nucleic acids from cell to cell. But you might ask, how did genetics work? Well, fortunately, we figured that out as well because we understand that there are certain molecules that are formed through chemical reactions and that there are hydrogen bonds that neatly match each base to other bases, and that was all discovered in the realm of chemistry. Sorry, clicker's not working as well. And then how does the chemistry work? That's where we kind of find ourselves today because, of course, it all comes back down to physics. We can explain the bonding in terms of quantum mechanics. We can explain the electrical interactions in terms of QED, although it's a nightmare if you actually want to try to do that. But those things are understood at the level of physics. So we have a very good understanding from the bottom down of how human beings may have originated, right? Well, that still leaves us, I think, with the questions that I posed earlier, which are, why does physics work, right? Why does the universe care about math? And why is the math that governs the universe so finely tuned that if it were just a tiny bit off, there would be no possibility of any of this stuff, evolution, genetics, chemistry, physics? I think it's not unreasonable to believe that this is the train of causation here, but I don't think this fully answers the question, which is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Why is there life? And why is the universe arranged in such a way that it can support interesting things happening? We're basically, I think, still asking those basic fundamental questions. And I'm not sure that science itself can ever fully answer some of those very fundamental metaphysical questions that we've been talking about. It can flesh them out, and it can provide insight into what's going on. But at the end of the day, science is a physical subject. It's not able to address all of these concerns because some of these relate to things that are inherently outside of the universe, such as where did the universe come from? I do think, though, that science has interesting and informative things to say about these, and hopefully it increases our appreciation for why the universe is the way it is. So that's all I have to say on God of the Gaps. I'm happy to talk more later, but I'd like to move on now to the question of why I believe in a personal God. So far I've kind of presented 3 lines of evidence that I think might point towards a cosmic order, maybe. And that's all well and good. But I really don't think that in light of all of the other things that we see about our world, the presence of evil and suffering, the way that certain religious groups have treated people over the past few centuries, and many other kind of problems we see with the world, that is enough to help us, to really get us to the point of belief in a personal God. Again, this is just my opinion. If that's enough for you, that's great. But for me, it's challenging to see the connection between those three things and the existence of a personal God. Maybe on the fine-tuning, maybe we could see a little bit of a connection, but not strong enough, in my opinion. But I'd now like to talk a little bit, since we're kind of leaving the realm of science proper, and we're kind of thinking now more about the pursuit of science and what that tells us about human beings. I'd like to do a little bit of a kind of a participation activity, because I'm worried I'm putting you all to sleep. Okay, so I'm going to claim that science requires a couple of things, but I'm not going to tell you what they are yet. I'm going to let you all work that out for yourselves. So, show of hands, who believes that the universe is made up of atoms? Great. Yeah, I forgot to raise my hand, but I also believe the universe is made up of atoms. Great. Who believes that the neutron is a subatomic particle that exists inside atoms? Show of hands. Wow. A lot of you guys believe in the neutron. Great. All right. Now, I hesitate to ask this because I know there are a couple of Course 22s out there who probably have done this. How many of you have performed an experiment where you've directly observed a neutron? Come on, we're at MIT. I'm sure some of you guys have. Yes, we got a couple. All right, yay, thank you. All right, good. So the point is, we all believe in neutrons, but none of us have ever seen them. None of us have ever done any experiment, really, to prove that a neutron exists, right? But we pretty much, at least I have no doubt that a neutron exists. And so we have to take it on trust, essentially. We have to trust other people, because none of us can perform all of the experiments ourselves. And in fact, I think in practice, we often end up crowdsourcing a lot of our opinions. So I'll give you an example here. This is from the Mulliken oil drop experiment. It was a very precise measurement of the electron's charge back at a time when people were still trying to figure out what that might be. And interestingly, the guy who started the experiment, Mulliken, he got it wrong. He had the viscosity of air slightly off. And so later people then tried to replicate that experiment. But you can see that over time, I'm sorry, it's a blurry graph, I got it from Wikipedia, the people who replicated the experiment, probably because they were worried about Mulliken's reputation as a prominent scientist, didn't actually accurately report the correct amount. They kind of gradually crept up towards the correct value, which is there at the solid line. And so I think it just goes to show you that while we do our best as human beings and as scientists to try to kind of objectively parse the data, in practice, because all of us are limited just by the amount of information we can handle at a time, we have to rely on other human beings and their experiences to inform our understanding of the world. So that's Exhibit A. Exhibit B, hopefully, also might be even more interesting. I kind of gave it away as a spoiler, but I'm going to do another show of hands here. How many of you all believe that originally life did not exist on the Earth, that there was a kind of a collection of chemicals that were not living, and that eventually they assembled into something that could be considered living, that replicated and eventually became, common ancestor to all of the other living organisms? Show of hands. How many? A good many of you. Good many of you. Not everybody, but that's fine. I find myself included in that group. I think it's reasonable to believe that. How many of you can provide an explanation for how that process came to be? Oh, okay. We have another. Well, I'll have to be talking to you afterwards. I would love to hear that, because I certainly am stumped. I do not know at all how the chemicals first assembled. Now, I understand in general that you can form liposomes and that nucleic acids can sequester in particular compartments, but in terms of an actual mechanistic understanding of what happened to the first cell, I really don't know. I don't know what it looked like. I have no evidence to suggest what it was. All I have is evidence to suggest what our last universal common ancestor was, because I can look at the commonalities among all of the organisms that exist on Earth. But I really don't know what the processes were that were occurring at that early stage. And yet, I find it reasonable to believe, as I think many of you do, that those processes happened, that that's how life formed, right? And what part of the reason I think that it's reasonable is because we've seen this happen before. We've seen how evolution and differentiation chemical processes can explain speciation and the development of pathogens and many other things throughout history, and that has been verified by archaeological evidence. So kind of inductively, we assume that that's also going to be true for the origins of life. But I think we have to recognize that that's not scientific per se. That's just faith, honestly. We have no evidence for that. That's just inductive reasoning. I think it's reasonable. but I think it's also good to note how hardwired that is into our brains. Okay, so the last word I'd like to talk about, if I can get the clicker to work. Sorry, I'm struggling here. Let's see. Okay, great. Is going to be this kind of a very fundamental thing about science. And I'm just going to do a thought experiment for you all here. Suppose that a rabbit just popped up on this table right here. I wish I had a rabbit because that would have been really cool, but I'm not very magically gifted. So just imagine that a rabbit just popped up on this table. We wouldn't just say, yep, that's what rabbits do sometimes. It's a spontaneously generating rabbit. Pop into existence, and then they leave for some time. No, we would say that's weird. There must be some explanation. Maybe someone slipped the rabbit in under the table, or maybe the one rabbit, two rabbits had a baby, or something, right? That explains that. That's consistent with our understanding of the rest of the natural world. And in fact, this is key to our pursuit of science in general, is the idea that the world actually has an explanation, the world actually makes sense, and that the explanations are simple and logical and tied together, that you can explain lots of things at once through physical laws such as the law of gravity or the law of electricity and magnetism, right? That's not at all obvious that should be true. And we're actually pushing the limits on our understanding of whether that's true when we go to subatomic scales with quantum mechanics. There are actually processes that are random. We can't necessarily know for sure whether or not a particle is going to be on this side of the slit or that side of the slit without interfering with its wave function. So it does appear at this moment, at least, pending further research, that there are limits on our ability to explain and understand the natural world. But even with that said, science has had a remarkable success in understanding much of the world around us. And so I think it's very reasonable to extrapolate that onto future potential discoveries. But again, that's not a scientific thought. That is, simply put, hope. We're just hoping that the universe is, in fact, explainable and understandable by the human mind. Because if it isn't, we're kind of stuck. There's nothing really we can do about it. So now I'd like to revisit what I had said earlier about kind of weighing the evidence for and against a personal God. And maybe you'll see where I'm going with all of this, hopefully. I don't know. What I'm trying to say here is that when the whole pursuit of science is based on thinking about and trusting other people's experiences. It's based on a hope that there's going to be an explanation for the world that takes all of the data that we have into consideration and provides a holistic, simple, and logical picture for how these things came to be. And it's also based on some inductive reasoning, honestly. We have to kind of extrapolate from our own experience and hope that that is true. And so when I look at scientific discoveries alone, that is not compelling enough for me to believe in a personal God. But then I also remember that science is not the only thing I believe in. So, for example, I believe that humans have rights. I believe that it's wrong to discriminate against people based on any form of identity that they have. I believe that it's wrong to kill people wantonly, and I believe that there are many that humans have dignity. I believe these things not because I observe them from science, and in fact, it's quite the opposite. If you look at our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, they're very tribal. In fact, some of them actually eat each other, which is kind of horrifying. But if you were to refer back to our best understandings of how science has understood human origins to try to create a system of morality, you might end up with something like social Darwinism or eugenics. And I think that's very dangerous to try to take science and use that to make morality. They do belong to separate spheres, and yet I do think that there are truths in both. So I believe in human rights. I also believe that life has meaning and purpose. And in fact, when I was struggling with my faith at the time I shared, when I had all of these questions, this was one of the things that called me back. Mostly it was just while I was sitting kind of there thinking about all this stuff, I realized, this is not a new thought, but if the universe is going to get swallowed up in some kind of a heat wave, or if it's going to shrink down into oblivion at some point and everything is going to disappear, especially human beings, then what is the point of everything, right? There really is no kind of eternal, lasting meaning. And in fact, not to be a downer, but probably most of your great-grandkids are going to forget who you are, or great-great-grandkids. And the reason I would suspect this is because how much do you know about your great-great-grandparents, right? Or great-great-great-grandparents? It's kind of discouraging. It's kind of depressing if you think about it that way. And that's the world we live in, if there isn't a God, I think, personally. At least, I find it much easier to believe in meaning and purpose if there is a God. So I'm not trying to say that, that the science proves that there's a God, and then that proves that we have meaning and purpose. I'm saying I, as a human being, kind of have to believe that there's meaning or purpose. Like, I exist. I'm trying to live. I'm trying to do things because I believe they matter. And because I believe that, that's just a truth I'm going to take as an axiom. I'm now trying to come up with a theory, an understanding of the world, just as we do in science, that takes into account all of these observations holistically. And so when I incorporate not only my belief in meaning and purpose, but also my belief that our minds are connected to truth, that we're not just living in the matrix, and that the physical processes that we learn about don't just determine our thoughts, but that maybe we actually have some connection to reality. When I think about consciousness and free will, when I think about my own personal experience of God, the historical evidence that I think exists for people who have had experiences of God, and the direct testimonies I've heard from people I trust, all of this evidence now adds up together, these data points, to suggest to me that maybe there is a personal God. And in fact, if I want to accumulate all of these disparate observations under the simplest heading, I would think that the best theory is the existence of a God. Or put differently, let's suppose that there's a null hypothesis, that there is no God. That's the null hypothesis I'm proposing. There is no personal God that cares about human beings. Okay, then let's take a look at the distribution of all possible kind of sets of experiences I could have as an individual. I think that depending on how you weight the evidence, you could put yourself in that zone. You could say, yeah, I don't really think there's much evidence for God. I think that the universe very well could exist as it does today without a God. But given all the things I just mentioned, I find myself in this region of low p-value. I think that, yes, the universe, it's not determinative. I think that there are some valid questions about the existence of God that would make me think it's not a given that there's a God in the universe, but I would think it's highly likely, given all the other things I believe about morality, about consciousness, about free will, about agency, about human rights, and the meaning, and my own personal experiences as well. So, all right. How am I doing on time? I think I'm way over. Sorry, y'all. Okay, so now I'd like to just talk about one more topic, really, one of the last questions, and it's the hiddenness of God. All right, so moving on, we're going to, oh, no, I'm just kidding. God is hidden, but hopefully we're going to talk a little bit about it here. And one of the things I'd like to do is, because again, I'm putting you all to sleep, yet another kind of participation exercise. Okay, actually, this isn't very participatory. This is going to be me. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to Google something. Let's see. I'll look up in Chrome. It's just going to take me a while here. No. Okay. Why? Okay, why is this guy taking so long to speak? Okay, and what's amazing is that if I type that in, I can actually get a whole list of AI-generated results that tell me why some guy might be taking a long time to speak. It's kind of crazy. And not only that, I get access to thousands and thousands of other search entries that might be related to that, right? Now, the reason I mention this is because one of the problems with the hiddenness of God is that it forces us to believe in something that we can't see, right? But I would argue that science also forces us to believe in lots of things that we can't see. In fact, the information that was coming to me on my phone is being transferred by radio frequency photons, right, from some Wi-Fi router somewhere in the building. Not only that information, but probably decades of music and centuries of history and philosophy and everything is being aired right now in this physical location where I'm standing on radio waves, and we're not aware of it at all, right? We all believe this to be true, right? We know that if I put a radio receiver right here, I could be listening in to countless amounts of intellectual discussion and music and all that, but we would have no idea if we had no receiver for that we're walking through swaths of information. And I find that wild to consider. That's something that's clear from modern science. But I find it even more difficult to think about some of the more abstract things that we believe in. And so I'll point to something that we really love here at MIT, which is, if I can get it, sorry, math. We all love math, right? Math, yeah. I heard some people who like math. So the reason I bring this up is we believe that math has a truth value, right? That you can make statements in math that are either true or false. and that these statements really have no connection whatsoever to the physical world. There are certain branches of, for example, category theory that are so esoteric. I asked one of my TFs, just give me one example. I just need to know what one example of a coset is. They could not think of an example because it's so distant from the world that we actually live in, and yet you can still make meaningful statements about those things. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a remarkable fact that the random musings of the human mind do in fact correlate at all with the behavior of the natural world. But even if they didn't, the truths of math would still have an existence kind of in the ether, right? They don't rely on physical properties to support the fact that math is true. And so I think, maybe not everybody here believes that math is a valid way of thinking, but many of us, I think, would believe that math is something that we can make truth claims about, but again, it's not observable. It does have an effect on our life. It is helpful for understanding things that are observable, and so in that way, it may parallel to some extent the belief that we have in God. But that, I think, is not a great example because both of those things are not personal beings, right? Both of those are just things. I think the real question for me is, why would a loving God not reveal himself, right? Why would God make it so hard for us to figure out whether or not he exists? I really don't have a perfect answer for this. I'd put some of the question here on the side of the scales where it's like, this makes it hard for me to believe in God. But I will draw on the writings of Leonhard Euler, who is a Swiss mathematician, very prolific, responsible for about a quarter of the combined mathematical output of the 18th century. And he's also the one after whom the number E is named. And he actually, being a devout Christian, wrote a defense of the inerrancy of Scripture to a German princess, which has now been passed down to us in the form of this text. So I'm not going to be reading that to you. I don't speak German, but I'm going to try to summarize his argument as best I can. And the way I'll do it is through a story. This is my really dumbed-down version for myself. So suppose that I like to think of God as a loving mother who is managing a daycare full of toddlers. Okay. Here are the toddlers. All right, now, the loving mother wants to introduce the toddlers to fruits and vegetables. She wants them to love fruits. She wants them to appreciate them for the health benefits they have for their lives, right? But she knows that if she takes the fruits and vegetables and gives them en masse to the toddlers, they're going to throw a fit. They're going to throw a tantrum, right? Nobody wants to eat fruits and vegetables at that age, I think. At least I didn't. And so what is she going to do? Well, I think one strategy you could take, maybe not necessarily the only strategy, but one way you could think about it is maybe the mother might set out a trail of just carrots for some of the toddlers. Maybe some of them might get grapes, and some might get some pineapple slices, and some might get radishes. Those unlucky toddlers who got the radishes. And so, what this would do is it allows each toddler to kind of select what fruit or vegetable they're most likely to appreciate, and takes them on a journey where they're able to gradually kind of get more and more accustomed to eating the fruits and the vegetables as they walk along, picking them up, eating them. This is also not very sanitary, but let's say they clean the floor. And so they might eventually come to the end here with the fruit basket, and that at that point, they might actually have come to an appreciation for what fruits and vegetables can do. Not only will they know what fruits and vegetables are, they're going to think fruits and vegetables are tasty, they're going to want more fruits and vegetables in them, and that's going to lead them to have healthier and happier lives. In some ways, now this is just an analogy and it's a very crude one, I think this may be the way that God provides evidence to us as well. I think that Euler would claim there are two things, kind of relationships we can have with God. We can know things about God, and we can love God. And Euler would say it's actually worse to know lots of things about God and not to love him. I think he would say it's better to not know things about him at all and still have the potential to love God. Because after all, in the Christian framework at least, that's the most important thing that you could have in your life, is the ability to love God. So I think that God is gentle and caring, honestly. I think that he wants people to come to him in whatever way, shape, or form they can, but I also think he doesn't force people to come to him. He leads them on. I think he places evidence in each of our lives that he exists, but I think that evidence is going to look different for every person. So I'm trying my best to show you what that trail of carrots looks like for me, but I wouldn't expect for someone else to find all of these things convincing. I would encourage you, however, to start looking for those areas where God may be placing specific pieces of evidence in your life, specific passions you may have, specific interests or questions you might have. That might be, or people. I think people are probably the most important way that God might be speaking through this. These are things that we should not ignore. I think because there's a whole host of blessings and experiences that lead to human flourishing at the end of the rainbow, if we can follow the path. It may be a little bit more circular for some. It might have some obstacles, so it may vary from person to person. But I do think that God, being caring, this is just, again, my belief, has placed enough evidence for everyone, if they are so desire, to find him ultimately. And that's how I think a loving God might exist in the world, even while being somewhat hidden. So to conclude, what does this mean for those of us who are people of faith? And I recognize that many in the audience and myself in the past may not have always been people of faith, and that's totally fine. But I think this is especially an important word to those of us who do profess to believe in a God, because if we do believe in a God who shows mercy to those who doubt, then we should really attempt to do the same. And in the Christian tradition, this is reflected in the book of Jude, where it writes simply, "Be merciful to those who doubt." And, I think there's very few better pictures of this than the way that Jesus himself treated people who came to him with questions. Jesus treated people who came to him from foreign lands. He treated people who were not of the same political ideology as him. He treated people who literally said, "Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief," who had just had trouble believing in him. And I think this is the way that God really looks on all of us. I think he sees us as his children, and he desires to show us mercy and grace. And that's no matter where we come from, whether we find it easy to believe in God or hard to believe in God, or maybe we can't believe in God at all. I still think God loves all of us. So, and desires to try to have a closer relationship. So basically, to conclude, thank you all for listening. I did want to say that I think God loves questions, and so do I. So we're going to have a little Q&A session after this. Love to kind of hear what you all are thinking and enter into that discussion with you. And lastly, I'd say that a lot of the evidence I presented up there for my own faith is not really just from the sciences and from thinking intellectually. It's from experiencing the way that I think God has worked in my life through community and through prayer, through reading, and in my faith, I'm a Christian, through reading the scriptures. And so I would say give it a try. This faith is not something you just have to take blindly. It makes predictions. I mean, I believe that if you accept Jesus into your heart, things will change. You'll see the difference. And that's a falsifiable prediction. You can try it. You can see what happens. I would encourage you to try, because I think some of the evidence that exists for God is only available to the people who are actively seeking it in that way, not just through their heads, but also through their hearts and the expression of their lives. But with that being said, thank you all so much for listening to my talk and my story. Really appreciate you all, and I'm happy to talk about any questions you'll have.
Thank you once again, Sam, for that quite thought-provoking discussion on science and the way your story and like how you came to know about God and things like that. So now we have the Q&A session where we would like to, where we've listened to this talk for about 30, 45 minutes. So there's a good chance that everyone has some questions here or there about different things. So now's the time to ask those questions. You can either ask a live question by just raising up your hand, and then someone will give you a microphone and then you can speak, or you can ask a question on Slido and upvote, as I said before. Please do try to keep the questions brief so that we can get through as many as we can, but also don't be hesitant to ask any question, because the deeper questions are the ones we really want to get at. And
yeah, we really welcome questions that challenge the viewpoints I've said in this talk. I would love to learn from you all as well.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'll take a question from Slido right now. Okay, so why would the universe require fine-tuning at all? Does it imply that God is constrained by some meta framework, or wanted it hard for a universe to exist?
That's a great question. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think fine-tuning may eventually be explained by some deeper level of mathematical theory. There might be some kind of organization. String theory, for example, purports to be able to explain some of the fine-tuning of the cosmological constants, and so maybe we'll eventually discover that's true. But what I do think is that possibly God, kind of desiring to make himself known to humanity, gives each generation of people and their science enough of a reason to believe in him, enough of the science and the big questions that are unexplained, that it is, because I think that if we really truly had figured everything out, if there was no fine-tuning and we were just content with the laws of physics as they are, I think it would tempt us to pride, honestly. I think we'd say, we figured it out. We don't need God. Even if we would need God on other levels, not to understand the universe, but for, say, meaning and purpose, or to understand morality. And so I think God throws just a little bit of uncertainty into each generation's level of scientific achievements, and that causes us to ask further questions. That causes us to probe deeper, either to understand a deeper level of order and symmetry and beauty and elegance, which we might find through the string theory, or if it truly is that these things have just been fine-tuned and God tweaked the dials and for no other reason but to give us life, that serves as evidence, I think, for our sake, not God didn't have to do that, but for our sake, that perhaps there is a designer who does care about life in charge of the universe. Yes?
I think when you're referring to fine-tuning, you're talking about like how specifically the universe is designed, like to the like how precise it is.
Yes.
I just want to add something on top. It's not really a question, but
Yeah.
you're referring to the concept of entropy, because what entropy basically says is if without order, the universe would take itself out. Any system, in a sense, would take itself out. So you need a certain level of fine-tuning for the universe to go long enough. So that'd be indicative of a loving God, if anything, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that possibly, I'd have to think about that further, but I think that there are considerations like that that would lead you to think that maybe the force behind the universe is in fact a loving God who cares about intelligent life. Yeah, thanks. Another from Slido, maybe?
Hello? Okay. Yeah, we'll take another from Slido then, since we had a live
thank you.
live input. So thank you, by the way. Okay, another from Slido. Even if the universe is intelligently designed, how does God explain this? Wouldn't God also have to be intelligently designed then? Who created God?
That's a great question. I like it. I like the way you're thinking. Again, so all these questions are just the way I'm answering them, this is just how I understand it personally. Sure, there are deeper, better understandings, but I like to think of God through kind of a Occam's razor kind of argument. You take the theory that has the fewest parameters and best explains the data with the least complexity, and that is the most likely to be correct, just probabilistically speaking, because of the parameter distribution. And well, that obviously doesn't carry completely over metaphysically. I would say that you could explain away some aspects of the universe through, for example, a multiverse theory, where you say, the universe is finely tuned because every possible universe that could exist has existed, and the only ones that have conscious observers in it are, by their very nature, the ones that can support life, right? So of course we ourselves as conscious observers find ourselves in a universe that supports life. That's all well and good. I mean, that does explain away the fine-tuning problem, but it requires just as much faith, because there is no evidence that every possible universe that can exist has existed, right? So that's just a proposition that people can make. My assertion, or for my own sake, I think that maybe does just as good a job as the, say, God hypothesis in explaining why the universe is finely tuned, but it does not do a good job of explaining why we might have morality, why we might have free will, or why we might have meaning and purpose, any of the other things I mentioned that I think point towards the existence of a God. So for me, a God is just a simple and very convenient, very simple explanation, which is the kind of thing that we look for in science, that explains a lot of data points all at once. And I'm not saying that every cause requires something to have caused that. I think there are philosophical arguments that suggest that the chain of causation may, for example, end, or it might be cyclical, or it might have an infinite regress. But what I do think is that as we progress further and further up the chain of causation, we expect things to be simpler and simpler. I'm kind of borrowing this argument from Aquinas. And so therefore, when we look at what could possibly be the simplest explanation for the world, God seems to fit there at the top or bottom of that causality tree. So that's why I find God to be, I don't think God needs to be explained. I think you could also just say that the universe doesn't need to be explained, but that kind of goes contrary to the impulse that we have as human beings to understand things at a deeper level. I think the thing that's special about God is kind of by definition the deepest level. You can't go further than God. And so we can just call whatever that thing that's at the end of the causality chain God, and then try to understand the attributes of that God through other means. That may not have made any sense, I'm sorry, y'all, but that's kind of the way I think about it.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any other live questions?
Wait.
I think what the question was asked, and you answered it very nicely, is if the universe is created by God, then who created God itself? So the question itself is going in the past. So when you say who created God, you're going in the past. Who created the gods? You're going more in the past. If you say that God created everything, you must agree that God created time and space together, because we agree physics is based on time and space. We're currently in time and space. So if God created time, the question itself is flawed because you're going back in time. You're saying who created God? You cannot ask that question because God created time.
That is one way of thinking about it. I think there is a level to which you can have causality without time. We associate very strongly time and causality. But I think that for example, in the Christian tradition, we believe that Jesus is the begotten Son of God. We don't believe that there was ever a time when Jesus was not there, but we do believe that the Son proceeds from the Father. So there's a notion where you could have kind of an eternal level of causality. One thing is the reason for another thing's existence and has been so from the beginning of time. But I do agree with you that we have some difficulties when we start to think about what it could mean for something to be before time, per se. I don't know if that actually makes any sense. Yes, got a question.
Hello? Okay, quickly before you ask your question, thank you for your input again. We really do want to keep this to questions specifically and not just inputs, so just like putting that out there.
We do appreciate the inputs.
Yeah, we do appreciate it though.
Yeah.
Yeah, just putting that out there. So
Yeah.
I have a question about kind of morality from an evolutionary perspective. What do you think about the thought that maybe the reason why you feel that you have meaning and purpose is because those are like evolutionarily necessary traits? It wouldn't be, very good for a species to not believe that its existence didn't matter. And that's sort of just one of those attributes that was necessary for that species to survive.
That's true. Lemmings are still around, but yes, in general, I agree. Most species should desire their own existence. I think this is interesting because evolution is an interesting branch of the sciences. It makes very few predictions, makes very few future predictions, right? It's hard to say, for example, what we as humans are going to evolve into next. Maybe we can understand this on the level of like viruses, but because of that, because it makes very few predictions, you can use evolution to explain almost anything, which is kind of interesting. You can basically find almost any example of moral behavior that you want in the natural world. You can find animals that are being altruistic and kind to each other. You can find animals that eat their young, right? You can also find all kinds of different psychological behaviors. Evolution could, in theory, be used to explain all of these, but it's very hard to test because, like I said, it doesn't make concrete predictions. So I think that while evolution maybe could be an explanation, on one level, I would respond that I think the types of morality that we see consistently passed down through history are similar, not always identical, but similar across many different cultures and exposed to many different types of environments. That speaks to at least some kind of a conserved structure, right, within morality, that there is not just a random evolution kind of leading us to that, but there is some part of the fabric of the universe or the way that the evolutionary processes are going that does drive us towards this belief. Now, I think to answer your question at a deeper level, there's kind of only so much we can do as human beings about the fact that our brains are influenced by the physical environment and our heredity, right? So, for example, one might argue that the very thoughts I'm having are just the product of my upbringing. I'm sure my upbringing plays a big role in it, right? And of the chemical factors and the neurotransmitters that I've been exposed to over the course of my life, that there maybe is actually no connection between what I'm saying and the truth of the real world. If you buy into a completely naturalistic, non-theistic view of the world, that is a risk we have to take. We have to take the risk that we are living in the Matrix, possibly, that we might be living in some kind of a world that's not actually connected to absolute reality. And but I think that argument is also a little bit self-defeating, right? Because, of course, that very thought that we might be living in the Matrix would then be a result of living in the Matrix, and so how do we know whether that's true or not? I mean, that's a little bit, I don't know how solid that argument is, but I would say it's certainly a question that's worth thinking about, is how much, if indeed our moral instincts are coming from evolution, then how much can we trust our other, say, lesser instincts that might actually have less selection pressure on them? And so if it really is the case that everything's coming from evolution, then I think we're in trouble. So I hope that's not the case.
Thank you. All right, we'll take the top question from Slido now. So I believe you, so you talked a bit about how you felt a bit like there was this hopelessness and things like that if you take away God. But the question now is, the person says, I don't think a world without God would be hopeless or devoid of morals or purpose. I think that we can find those things for ourselves. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm glad that you don't find a world without God hopeless. That's certainly a good thing. I think that you, yeah, I mean, personally, I find that challenging. And I don't know whether this is just my innate wiring, one might say, as a kind of someone who's been programmed to feel this way, but the way I feel is that I have this deep longing for something eternal, for something lasting, and that I also am very cognizant of my own death. And maybe right now, it's not really on the forefront of my mind, but it does come back every once in a while, and as we get older and older, I think it comes up more and more, and this has been an age-old question that I think is hard to answer if you don't believe in a God. And so, yeah, maybe you can create your own meaning. I'm not sure. Maybe you can just make it. I don't know how that would happen. It doesn't seem, to me, that doesn't seem consistent with the types of ways that we often think of philosophical and scientific reasoning working together to kind of create a cohesive picture of the world. It kind of seems to me like we're just going to just say that can happen and then hope that it's true. And I also think that meaning by its very nature kind of has to transcend the self. I don't think we're sufficient in and of ourselves to kind of provide purpose and meaning to our own lives. But again, like I'm saying, if you find that this is true or that this is not the case for you, I'm not wishing you to feel hopeless or meaningless. Maybe, for example, this is not the line of evidence in my worldview that would lead you to God. But I think that for me, I would find it very hopeless or meaningless if I didn't believe in a God.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got a question from Henry over here.
Hi, Sam.
Hey, Henry. Thanks for coming.
Good to be here. To call back to your previous analogy with the fruits and vegetables, if each person kind of goes down their own path with different fruits or vegetables, which suggests that they then have a different experience of what God would be and a different interpretation of how to live their lives through that journey. And in my experience, I've struggled with, what my own values and beliefs are, and kind of belief of what God might be against what religion seems to be saying and telling. So how do you reconcile your own experiences and beliefs with sometimes conflicting things from religion?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Again, I'll just answer this on a personal level, how I myself actually try to deal with this. There's a slide I brought up, shows a medieval painting of Jesus interacting with a woman, this woman who is a Canaanite. one of the peoples that in the Old Testament was supposed to be wiped out by the Israelites. And this woman comes to Jesus and says, Lord, please heal my daughter. And Jesus says, basically, it's not for me to give the children's bread to the dogs. Whoa, well, like full stop right there, right? Is Jesus a racist? Right? That's a very, very challenging statement for me to hear. And if I had heard that and I were her, I probably would have walked away. But what I find really interesting is that this woman, at least if we believe the story, didn't stop there. She took Jesus' response. She didn't disregard it. But she also understood that there was a deeper level, kind of a truth that God really still did care about her, that he really did want her to succeed, I guess. And so she pushes back and says, God, even the dogs can eat the food that's under the children's table. And Jesus says, woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. So I think what this story speaks to, in my experience, is when we hear something difficult from God, or if we hear something difficult about God, sometimes it's untrue, first of all. Sometimes that's something that's passed on through the result of human error, or just, I don't know, it could be many, many different sources of error, I think, that could lead to us believing untrue things about God. But sometimes when there really are those difficult things, I think God calls us to press in, to not just immediately take things. I mean, I think you have to take what seriously is known about God. You have to take that and wrestle with it. But I think often there's going to be a deeper level. And that deeper level is going to be somehow rooted in God's love and care for you as a human being. That's the assumption I have to go into when I deal with difficult questions. Like, for example, a difficult one for me is, how could a loving God send people to hell? I really don't have a great answer for that. You also, there you go. You can stump me if you want. But when I think about that question, that's really tough for me. And I do know that is something that's believed, and I personally think that it must probably be possible, although I hope that no one goes to hell. But I think that what I have to do there is lean into what I know for sure to be true about God, for 100% to be true, which is that he's a loving, caring, and that I don't think he desires anyone not to be saved. And that's what I know for sure. And then there are some of the things that are on the periphery, which I'm still working to understand, and I call on God for grace to understand those things. But I do believe that even though everyone may be exposed to different lines of evidence, that God is so immense that no human mind can comprehend even the smallest bit of God in the whole scheme of the infinity of who God is. And so even if all of us are seeing completely different attributes of God, which I think many people see overlapping attributes, but even if it were the case that everyone saw a completely different attributes, I still think that would be possible and still not understand all of who God is. And so I don't necessarily see a contradiction with different people understanding different things about God, as long as those things that people understand are not in contradiction with each other. They could just be different realms of knowledge.
Thank you. Okay, I think this might be the last question we take on Slido. So this question is, how do you visualize God if we cannot see him? It seems hard to pray, for example, to someone we can't see. And I don't mean to also like take away the question that the person's asking, but I think also from a scientific perspective, how do you like come to terms with like the whole spiritual and things like that? But
yeah. Wow, that's a good question. I agree. It is hard to pray to a God that you can't really imagine. Well, I visualize, I think as a Christian, I have the unique ability to visualize God as Jesus. I said earlier that we couldn't see or touch God, but I think I was speaking about God in his fullness. Well, actually, now I'm really on some theological thin ice. I guess I'm going to take that whole statement back. I think that in the past, people have been able to see and to feel and to touch Jesus in his fullness of being both man and also in his fullness of God. And so when I pray to someone, I can imagine, as a Christian, I can pray to Jesus. That gives me, now I don't know what Jesus looked like. I heard something very interesting recently, which is that Jesus was probably about 5'1". because most people of his time period were about that height, and Jesus certainly didn't stand out. He required a Judas to like call him out in the garden so that people could see who he was. So that's just a good perspective to have, I think. Yeah, it makes us rethink some of our assumptions about height, because the Son of God was probably about 5 foot. So, yeah. But I think that I don't know what Jesus looked like. I think that's okay. I think that people throughout each culture have kind of envisioned Jesus as looking somewhat like themselves. And I think there's good reason for that, which is that Jesus invites us into union with him, and that ultimately we are all each individually called to look like Jesus, that we are all supposed to be part of the body of Christ. And so I'm not advocating praying to ourselves, but I am saying that in the person of Jesus, and particularly the way that he's described in the Gospels, that gives me something more concrete to imagine when I'm praying.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could we just give a round of applause to Sam? All right, and that is the finale of this series that we had, Reasons for God, where we talked about these questions. It's of course not the end. These things still continue, and if you do have any questions, you can always go to Sam Detmer or anyone else that you know, like also touch on these questions. And yeah, so if you're curious about any of these things, we encourage you to continue being curious. But now we just have a few things to know before we like end for today. We have a feedback form, and there's 2 things on there. There's if you fill out the feedback form, you have a chance to win $30 of MIT Tech Cash, which guys, Tito is like, I'm addicted. But anyway, or you have a chance to win Girl Scout cookies. And so if you would like to have a chance to win those, please do fill out the feedback form. Additionally, there's also some opportunities to just to get to know a bit more about the situation, how you guys feel, so that we can give better events for everyone, and to learn more about how things went, etc. Next steps, if you feel like you need someone to talk to or just somewhere to get connected, whatsoever. So I would encourage everyone to fill that out and just see what's there, and yeah. We'll have a few minutes for that. All right, so hopefully you've had some time to fill that out. We will we'll be doing the giveaway in a little bit, so just stay tuned for that. So now we've come to the moment where it finally is the end of this, very much the end of this experience, this series, everything. So we would like to thank you guys all for coming. Thank you for all being open, for giving your time and just like being open to hearing and just listening to the different people talk, whether they were, as I said in the beginning, people who are a lot older than us and like have really wrestled with some of these questions, or people who just are continuing their PhD now. You're never too young or too old, so thank you very much to everyone. We have some books outside if you are curious and you just want to read a book. Somehow my phone opened up the like AI assistant. I'm not sure how that happened, but either way, free books outside if you are curious and if you're one who reads books. I am not. And there's also food I think there's food if anyone's still hungry and would like some more. Please feel free to take anything from here. We don't need them. So yeah, if you still want, then please do. And Yeah, you're welcome also to stay and talk if you have any questions, if you have any discussion, if you want to just like hear from another person. And yeah, that's basically that. So thank you very much once again for coming. We hope all is well. And yeah, have a nice evening.
And the winner. And the winner is Nicholas. So I'm going to not pronounce your last name right. Petrezak? Nicholas Petrezak, right here.
If you're looking for a sure thing, I can tell you where to look. Every day I bet my life on every story in the book. First moment of the first day till the ending of the end. One thing's been true again and again and again. My God can't lose. Win, 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 and it's nothing new. Never been a mountain that he can't move. He's undefeated, best believe it. I'm sure because I've seen every single thing that he's done for me. I've had a ticket to a front row seat. My life is a proof of the one thing he can't do. My God can't lose. He's got the kind of reputation that turns fear into faith. A history of salvation that makes a sinner wanna praise. Anytime I need a champion, that is all he's ever been. He always comes through again and again and again. My God can't lose. Win, 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 and it's nothing new. Never been a mountain that he can't move. He's undefeated, best believe it. I'm sure because I've seen every single thing that he's done for me. I've had a ticket to a front row seat. My life is a proof of the one thing he can't do. My God can't lose. Never has, never will. Always wins when it's still doing what only he can do. Take a look, my God can't lose. Never has, never will. Always wins when it's still doing what only he can do. Take a look, my God can't lose. My God